Well, Jamie Shea is a former senior NATO official. I asked him how the delivery of the Patriot missile system from the United States might change the course of this conflict.
Well, first of all, it's going to be very important for the United States and other allies to train the Ukrainians to use the Patriot system, because the Patriots have a multi-person crew and they're much more complicated to operate, requiring a lot more training than the type of systems that the Ukrainians have been receiving from the US and other allies up to now. Obviously, the Russians will say they're targets, but there's nothing new there, Jamie, because any kind of Western arms system that's sent to Ukraine is seen by the Russians to be a legitimate target, and the Russians regularly claim that they've destroyed many of these systems, although there's no way of verifying that, of course.
What do these drone strikes today tell us about Iran's involvement in the fighting in Ukraine?
Well, it shows that the Iranians are up to their neck in terms of the support they're giving to the Russians at the moment. It also shows that the Iranians are not selling simply one batch of these Shahad drones to Russia, but several. The good news in that, if it can be called good news at all, is that it does imply, if Moscow is having to go to Tehran for its weapons, that Russia is now starting to run out of its own stocks. It's starting to have production problems. The sanctions, particularly on the transfer of electronics for weapons, are working. But what I think the West would really be worried about, Jamie, is if the Iranians follow up and start supplying Russia also with short-range ballistic missiles, which could be a lot more destructive than these drones. And I believe that one of the reasons why the United States is now giving Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine, which it had not done hitherto for, is because the Patriots are one of the very few systems that could be effective against these Iranian short-range ballistic missiles if they start arriving in the arsenal of Russia in the days ahead.
President Putin has warned of a long war, and there are signs that Russia is making some gains, again in Donbass. Let's just consider for a moment where you might see the conflict going next, a sit rep almost.
Well, I think next spring is going to be decisive because we're going now, of course, to winter. Experts differ as to whether winter means a complete halt in military operations or not. The Ukrainians clearly have an interest in trying to keep the war going throughout the winter to prevent the Russians resupplying their forces, to prevent the Russians training their forces, and to prevent Russia building deep fortifications in the territories that it still controls, First World War kind of trench systems, which of course would make it harder for the Ukrainians to advance. On the other hand, the Russians want to keep the war going because Putin, having proclaimed that he has annexed 4 provinces of Ukraine, over which he has only about 50% control at the moment, clearly he doesn't want to lose face by not being able next spring to go back on the offensive and completely conquer the territory of those 4 provinces. So I think both sides next spring will want to keep the conflict going, and it depends really next spring who is successful when big military operations resume. If it's the Ukrainians, more support from the West for the idea that they can liberate their territory. If it's the Russians who seem to have the upper hand, having used the winter to regroup, then you may get more countries in the West calling for Ukraine and Russia to work out some kind of compromise peace at the negotiating table.